Okay, so this is the first official panel of the day. And it's the fact-checking industry today. It's moderated by Erin Sylvester, sitting to my left, who is the managing editor at the Walrus magazine. And I'll let Erin take it away.
Thanks, Allie. So yes, I am Erin. I'm the current managing editor at the Walrus. I was previously head of research just before Allie was head of research and just after Vivian. So little head of research sandwich here, which means that all of us at some point have overseen the fact checking work that the Walrus does. The Walrus is a fact checked Canadian magazine that does now check all the journalism it produces. So we have overseen the department and the checkers that do that. Including one of our panelists here, Lucy Uprichard, who's a former Walrus fellow and current freelancer at the Walrus, among many other things. So I will pass it over to our panelists now to each introduce themselves and, if possible, to describe a little bit about what fact checking means in your work and how each of you interact with fact checking. So I'll go to Lucy first, who is sitting here with me.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, my name is Lucy Uprichard. I am a freelance writer, fact checker, and editor, and I'm also currently an archive student at McGill University. I am from the UK originally, and I'm assessed in Chicago, or so-called Montreal. In terms of my own fact-checking work, I have worked with a lot of Canadian magazines at this point. I am the senior researcher with Reader's Digest. I was the editorial fellow with the Walrus from 2020 to 2021, and I do fact-checking generally for like the Globe and Mail, Toronto Life, Briarpatch, and this, and Maisonneuve, and lots of others. And maybe the most relevantly for today, I helped fact-check the fact-checking guide for this fact-checking conference. And I'm really excited to discuss the fact-checking industry. And I'm basically a full-time freelance fact-checker. So editorial fact-checking is really my bread and butter. I've kind of accidentally professionally specialized in it, but I don't regret it. And yeah, I'm excited.
Thanks, Lucy. Next, if it's okay, I'll pass it over to Peter Canby, who's the former head of fact-checking at The New Yorker.
Hi, yes, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. As Erin just said, I retired 2 years ago, so I still am kind of in the loop at the New Yorker. I'm aware of what's going on, but I did preside over the checking department for a long time. And over that time, it evolved a lot. So I'm happy to speak about it. I'm now basically, as I said, retired, but I'm also freelance writing, which I've done all the while anyway. So I look forward to speaking with the other panelists.
Sounds great. And then I'll pass it over to Greta, who works at NPR.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I'm Greta Pittenge. I work on NPR's research archives and data strategy team. So I actually am trained as a librarian, and fact checking is not my full-time job. I also do research and manage the archives at NPR. And I'm based here in Washington, DC. And see, I guess, yeah, I'm excited to talk with everybody. I think the distinction, besides me not being a full-time fact checker, is that I also am working with an audio-based NPR's National Public Radio. So mostly podcasts and broadcasting, but also some print work that I work with for fact checking.
Thank you all. So I'm really excited to dive in. I have a lot of questions. I will try to keep each of them fairly brief, although I have a lot to ask. So I think first of all, I wanted to open with a very brief kind of description of editorial or magazine style fact checking, however you know it. Vivian and Ali touched on this a little earlier in their presentation for those of you who are here, but basically there's sort of the more well-known political style fact checking that a lot of people associate with the term fact checking these days. So that's something like what Daniel Dale does on Twitter, where he takes a statement, say, that a politician has said, and says, like, here's how accurate this is. Here's the sort of sources that back up my view of how accurate this is. Here is, you know, basically, like, is this true or false? Often political fact checking will sort of rate things on a scale of trueness to untrueness. So that is one type of fact checking, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. Today, we are talking about editorial or magazine style checking, which, as Vivian and Ali said earlier, happens before publication and it happens behind the scenes. So it usually involves a fact checker going through a piece of journalism, checking every single detail sort of before it ever gets to print. So you don't have to do the kind of like here's a statement that was or wasn't true to Twitter, because it all happens internally within the magazine. So the version that the public sees is the sort of corrected one with just the hopefully true details presented. So with that to kind of ground our discussion, I know all three of the panelists are very familiar with that type of fact checking, but still just for the audience to know what we're going to talk about today. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the topic of this panel is the fact checking industry today. And I think there's kind of a couple things to unpack within that title. Both what is the fact checking industry, like what does that mean to each of us? And how has that industry changed since the beginning of your career? An example of that is that younger journalists often are more familiar with the term fact checking, but often are thinking of that political style fact checking rather than the way that we do it in sort of longer form journalism. So with the industry today, how have those sort of standards changed over the course of your career? And if you don't mind, Peter, I'd love to start with you.
Okay, great. Well, so that's several questions you're asking.
Yes.
And let me think, where do you want me to start? Tell me, because
I'd love to hear what you think of as the fact checking industry. What does that sort of term mean to you?
it's a little bit hard to say because there are kind of several streams in the kind of journalism where we practice what you refer to as magazine fact checking, and one is in newspapers, even though those aren't magazines, where there is effectively no fact checking. And it's interesting to me, the idea is that reporters are trained with checking their own stories. And it's interesting to me that at the Times, for example, there are checking departments in their magazine run by a former colleague of mine, and there's also one in their opinion section. And I think that's because the writers in the opinion section don't necessarily have journalistic training. So there's that. And in magazine checking, I have been at the New Yorker off and on for decades. And when I started, it was more unique to the New Yorker, but not entirely unique. I mean, Time and Newsweek in the old days had reporter researchers who helped compile stories, but the New Yorker, with the sort of oppositional fact-checking tradition, was somewhat unique. I think somewhere over the decades, and I really have been there long enough to be able to talk about decades, it evolved to a more general practice at magazines in New York and Washington. And it is continuously changed over the whole time I've been there. And it had one radical change inside the New Yorker when Tina Brown took over as editor. And I can't give you a date on that, but it was early 90s. And that more or less coincided with the decision on a famous case involving one of our distinguished writers, Janet Malcolm. And this is a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, although ultimately it was bumped back down to a district court. And she wrote a profile of a man named Jeffrey Mason, who was a psychiatrist who had just taken the job running the Freud archives in London. And she quoted him as saying it was going to be a place of sex and fun and so on. And he took that to be worth a lawsuit and accused her of having compressed and distorted quotes. And so that was a time in the New Yorker fact-checking history when we didn't ask writers for their notes and their transcripts. And that piece ran a long time ago, 1983, but it didn't finally get resolved until 1993, at which point the district court set a standard that publications are responsible for their own use of quotes. So we set up new standards at that time in the New Yorker, which involved getting, when writers submitted stories, that they would then give us their notes and transcripts as well as their contacts and whatever background information they had. So that was perhaps the biggest and most radical change in the time that I presided over the fact-checking department. The second one had to do with technology, and that is the New Yorker now has effectively two streams for copy, and one of them is the print stream, which is stories that are developed over months and sometimes have 50, 60 sources, and the digital stream, because we have a digital daily. And if you read the New Yorker's website, there are ways that you can figure out whether it's a print piece or a digital piece, but they're not easy, and they're not they're not readily apparent. But the digital pieces are fast turnaround by design. So they're pieces that are reported in a week often, and edited in a day, and fact-checked in a day or a few hours. So we have, when I left the New Yorker, which is just about 2 years ago, I had, I think, 24 people working for me, 24 checkers, 3 deputies, and half of those were working on digital pieces and half were print, more or less. And now there are, I think in the aftermath of my departure, the New Yorker is putting a lot of money into Condé Nast, actually, which is the parent organization of the New Yorker, is putting a great deal of money into their digital product. And so the digital site has grown, and there are now 30 fact checkers in the department that I used to run. And they no longer have different streams in checking for print and digital. But so that's another big change. And so why don't I let some of the other participants go on about how their jobs have changed.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, actually, I'd love, if you don't mind, Lucy, to kind of pick up on that thread, just because you've worked at so many different publications. What do you see as kind of the fact-checking industry today, and how do those standards sort of change depending where you're working?
Yeah, there's just not a ton of consistency, I would say, from newsroom to newsroom and how places fact check. It's really interesting to hear Peter talk about how there's now 30 fact checkers in the newsroom, because that's just unthinkable at any newsroom that I've been at. I'm not aware of any Canadian magazine that employs long-term full-time fact checkers, like people who are there from 1 year to the next. I started fact checking in 2016, which is also kind of when the political fact checking started becoming more prominent. It's definitely something that I've noticed people talk about more and more. People will discuss fact checking, but doesn't mean that the resources are being diverted to newsrooms in any sort of meaningful way. Vivian actually has a great article about this in the Walrus that discusses how much resources and funding goes towards kind of political fact checking, which is kind of after the fact checking. I think that in people's imagination, that fact checkers maybe have more power than they have in reality. I generally don't have any input on how something is framed. I can only do corrections before something is published. So yeah, it's a strange thing. I think that lots of magazines do outwardly value fact checking a lot, and it's in their mandates that they value it, but that's not necessarily always reflected in how it's funded and how stable fact checkers are as laborers. I know we're going to talk about that a bit later on, but yeah.
Thank you. And Greta, I'd love to get your voice on this as well, especially from kind of the audio perspective. Like, would you say that the industry changes when you're talking about radio or podcasting? Or yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, exactly. I think I also came to my current job in 2016. So right around the time when there was definitely more political fact checking, but I think also a bigger focus on podcasts in the audio space. So previous to checking podcasts, my department would mostly focus on fact checking commentaries, kind of similar to what Peter said about columnists and opinion pieces needing to be fact checked in magazines or newspapers, excuse me. That would be what we would do. But now with the rise of like long form podcasts, we definitely are getting more scripts from those departments. I think I hear credits for fact checkers on other podcasts as well. So I think that that's a space where audio is actually like focusing on doing more fact checking and making it, it's not super visible, but at least we're in the credits. So that's definitely been interesting. But I think otherwise, like the rise of political fact checking has not really changed the way that I explain my job, because I'm already a librarian in a newsroom, which is like a dying field already. So fact checkers also kind of not being heavy resources is a similar thread.
Librarian, newsroom, fact checking, these are all like very industries that have really changed a lot, or I think are can in many ways be precarious. And that is actually what I'd love for us to talk about next is, as you said, Lucy, like, especially I think in Canada, we're used to a lot of fact checking being done by very junior or very precarious workers. So these are often interns or people on temporary contracts, freelancers, the most junior people in a newsroom if they are sort of hired and work in the newsroom. And I really want to talk about how that can affect the work that fact checkers are able to do. Like, how honest can you be if you're a freelancer versus if you're on staff? What does it say about how our industry values checking? And I'd love to start with you, Lucy, because that's so much of where your experience is freelancing with different publications.
Yeah, I think it has a huge impact to not have that kind of security and to always be a freelancer when you're fact checking. I think that I am quite blunt in the way that I speak with editors, but that's more about who I am as a person than my sort of place within the industry. I think that it's really difficult for people to speak up. And I think that it's kind of important to acknowledge as well that a lot of fact checkers and a lot of freelance journalists, they do tend to be like women or queer or marginalized. And traditionally fact checking has been seen as kind of women's work anyway. And you're running up a higher chance of being seen as difficult the more that you sort of push back at stuff. And I think it's going to be riskier for you a lot of the time to be doing that. And yeah, I think it's a problem, not just in journalism, but across lots of industries, that fact checking in the newsroom, it's traditionally been this kind of entry-level position that you get into, and then you can kind of work your way up in the newsroom. And then because they're all freelance or they're all outsourced in some way, there's no opportunity for you to kind of climb up in the newsroom anymore. And so you have this kind of class of workers who are very precarious and very poorly paid, but who are getting more and more experience all of the time. And there's not always somewhere to move from that. Like the Walrus is great because it has a great head of research position and a great head of research. Yeah, just the position. But lots of places don't have that. And I think that when you don't have those things and you don't have a whole big room of fact checkers who all get to talk together, like this conference is great, but it's really difficult to have these kind of conversations usually. And that results in a kind of lack of, I would say, lack of standards in some ways, and a lack of institutional knowledge, and just a lack of dialogue that you get to have with your colleagues. Like as a freelancer, I so rarely get to actually speak with my colleagues about professional issues. And I think that's something that's missing probably from my day-to-day professional life.
Greta, I'd love to kind of hear from you on this, because I think in some ways your position kind of can straddle both worlds, where you're both working with freelancers, you're working kind of researching different things, but you are sort of within the newsroom. What's your sort of perspective given that position you're in?
Yeah, so like what Lucy said about how it's usually a skill to be developed. Like fact checking is a thing where like or earlier in their career journalists are developing a skill. This is already a skill I have, and I'm not looking to move up as a journalist. I'm already kind of in the career path that I want to be in as a researcher and archivist. So it's, but at the same time, there are also people, I mean, at my own organization that have, that are doing that kind of work, like people lower in their career or just trying to like develop those skills. And they won't stay fact checkers forever. And I do think that because fact checking is not my full-time job, that does kind of make it more precarious and undervalued work. We don't have a fact checking department at NPR. We're the de facto department because we are good at it, but it's not like in our mandate forever that that's exactly what we were created for. So I actually met Ali and Erin through working with Ali on as a freelancer, and I was at NPR, and so we partnered together to fact check some scripts. And that is partially because my department doesn't do, we don't call sources, because that's not something that I'm like just resourced or trained to do, as well as people who are more involved in doing journalism and reporting work. So I often work with another fact checker or with the producer on the piece to do that part of the fact checking. So that does kind of, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I don't really have a thought on that right now, but yeah, we have both my team, the research team, freelancers, and others in the newsroom, both interns and newer journalists doing fact checking work, and also people who've been there for a long time, and that's just part of their job, fact checking their own pieces. So it is kind of split amongst a lot of different people.
That's really interesting. And yeah, Peter, I'd love to hear a little bit from you, because it sounds like you may actually have kind of a different perspective here, in that the New Yorker does have a sort of official fact checking department with people who are full-time, I assume, as fact checkers. So I'd love to hear, what you have to say about how that changes how fact checking work can be done.
Sure. First, I want to disagree with Lucy on one thing, and Lucy characterized herself as abrasive and blunt. And having been fact checked by Lucy, I would just rather characterize her as smart and effective. So I actually really enjoyed working with her, and that was on the guide. But yeah, the New Yorker is somewhat distinctive. For example, my boss, David Remnick, my former boss, once told me that when he went out and spoke about the New Yorker with people, and he said this, I've got to say a little bit resentfully, he said the first thing they asked about is the fact-checking department. And, people referred to us as the legendary fact-checking department, which was kind of more a burden than a something that we were pleased with, because we had so many people writing in saying, you got this wrong, and didn't you know they used to have fact checkers at the New Yorker, and what are you thinking of? And Harold Ross and William Shawn must be turning in their graves. So we had a high standard that people expected of us. And I was also just going to, before I get to the role of the checkers more specifically, just about people's expectations of New Yorker checkers, is we had a writer, Rafi Kachadurian, who wrote early on about Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. And when Julian Assange was in the latter stages of his stay in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, Rafi managed to get access to him and write a piece about him. And the time that Rafi had with Julian Assange was very negotiated, and he was inaccessible and a little crazy seeming from the outside. But when we were about to sign off with him, he said, wait a minute, I'm entitled to a fact-checking call. I didn't get a fact-checking call. So the expectations of fact-checking had extended to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, even when they were in a taking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. The New Yorker, the fact-checking is so baked into the New Yorker's editorial process that it's kind of inextricable, and that's grown over the years, and that's something that I was very careful about. I was big on protecting the editorial role of fact-checkers and not having them blown off by either writers or editors. The people we hired weren't really, it was a kind of a mid-level job at the New Yorker. It wasn't a starting job. We did have for a while freelancers, but a number of years ago, we got rid of them. And we got rid of them in the sense we gave them staff jobs. And there's a union now at the New Yorker. And with all that kind of thing, it was started largely, or at least partly, inside the checking department. Unbeknownst to me, which I found quite amazing. So checkers do well at the New Yorker. One of the bromides that I always offer to checkers is that part of your job is managing power from a point of relative powerlessness. And in other words, you want to get what you want from people who are more nominally powerful than you, i.e. editors and writers. And you do that by making your work so smart that it's not, easily turned aside. So that was the kind of emphasis. It's a big part of the editorial process at the New Yorker, and I worked very hard to keep it that way. And I think one of the reasons it is that we've developed a tradition of very complicated reported pieces. And back when I started in the William Shawn era, those pieces were kind of writer driven. But the big change that came when Tina Brown came is that they started assigning ideas to writers, and then the writers would do on a really tight deadline these very controversial reporting pieces. And oftentimes what happened is that the editors would fall into the role of trying to put the narrative together, and the checkers would fall into the role of making sure that the argument was not just the facts were correct, but that the argument was balanced. And that's slightly more complicated process, I think, than what people traditionally think of as is this name spelled right. So that is, I think that answers some of the questions that you asked.
Yes, it does. And I'd actually love to pick up a little bit on a number of the threads that you raised, but I'll try to keep to one right now. You talked about your work making sure that the checkers aren't going to be sort of blown off and that checking becomes an integral part of the editorial process. I'm kind of curious, do you think, like, how did you do that in a way that can't be undone, if that makes sense? Like, does fact checking need a champion in the newsroom, or is there a way to sort of make this a more important part of how our industry operates? And is there sort of a way that happened at the New Yorker that is scalable? Sorry to use a very tech word.
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is to that. It is, I mean, I think in the internet era, there are so many, it's funny for me to even talk about the internet era as if there were another era, which in my case there was, but for the rest of you, possibly not. There's so much unreliable information out there, and there isn't even, I mean, just when we started first being dependent on the internet, I had the brilliant idea that we should write guides to what were reliable sources. And I think the checkers who were younger than I am knew that was ridiculous, but we would say, like, okay, cinema, here are the 6 good sources, or Justice Department, Supreme Court, here are the 7 good sources that you could use. And so it was like pulling teeth to get these answers out of the checkers. I assigned each one of them an area. And what was interesting to me is that by the time they filed their results, which is like 2 months or something that would take me to pry these things out of them, most of the sources that they were listing were already superseded by other ones. So that's the nature of the internet. It's voluble, and there are not a lot of hard facts that are really reliable, and there are lots of things that are not reliable. So really, it's an art. It's not a science about how you chase those things down. And if you're dealing with investigative, complicated pieces in Washington, as we did all the time, or in any, doesn't have to be Washington, anywhere, it was very important to me that we at least aspire to talk to all the sources, and not just to all the sources, but to everybody who's named in the piece. So in other words, if there were somebody whose actions were characterized by somebody else that the writer was quoting, we wanted to go to the person whose actions were characterized, even if the writer didn't speak to that person. And of course, we wouldn't do that in a blind way that was just going to cause problems, but we would talk with the editor and writer and tell them, we need to call this person. How do we want to go about it? Do you want to make the initial call to the writer, or do you want us to? And, it would go both ways. We had a series of complicated stories, which we call write-arounds. And I can think of one recently where a very good reporter of ours named Connie Brook did a piece 3 years ago on Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer who was the lawyer for Jeffrey Epstein. That was a big 10 or 12,000 word piece. And Alan Dershowitz learned or determined quickly that it was not going to be a friendly piece, so he refused to talk to Connie Brook. But when it got to the checking level, it was typical, as too often happened, it got dumped in the schedule really soon, and I put really fast. I put 3 checkers on it. The 3 checkers spent, I think, 9 hours in one day on the phone with Alan Dershowitz, several calls. And I remember leaving at like 8 at night, and they were still in the middle of one of these calls, and he was threatening them with lawsuits each stage of the way. And also in the beginning, that they had agreed that all the fact checking would be off the record. In other words, it was not meant for him to use in his in any way. But by the end, he said, by 9 hours later, he said, well, this is very nice. I've taped this whole thing, which of course we were taping it too. And so it was, everybody was taping. And he said, I'm going to use all this stuff. And we said, no, we didn't. We agreed in the beginning it was off the record. He said, did we? And he'd forgotten all about it. So we had to reproduce that part of the beginning of the discussion in which we agreed that it was going to be off the record. So for that kind of story, fact checking is so indispensable and so part of the investigative detail of those stories that it's pretty hard to know how we would undo it. And of course, everything is possible, but I think when you undo fact checking, at least on stories like that, you run into problems right away, which are probably, could be more expensive than getting rid of 30 fact checkers, which, yeah, that's a massive expense, especially because now in the post-union era, they got paid pretty well before the union, in my opinion. And now I'm not privy to what they get paid now, but I think it's a news guild, so they're probably paid like junior reporters. Which isn't a lot of money, but it's something. So there's a rambling answer for you. I apologize.
No, that was great. And really, it's always very interesting to hear behind the scenes how the stories that we read in the New Yorker or elsewhere are made, and how important. I think it's really also key for everyone at this conference to hear like how important fact checking is, and how it isn't just about going over exactly what the reporter did. Like, it is its own process. It does build the journalism that we're doing, whether or not it is off or on the record and makes it in the story in any detail. It's still an important part of the whole journalistic process. So I really appreciated that answer. Thank you for that. I want to switch tacks a little, because one thing that we're talking about is sort of, you mentioned the importance of calling sources back, which we've already talked about a little bit today. Ali and Vivian in their guide really emphasize the importance of speaking to sources again, how that can help recontextualize the conversation a reporter had. And Greta, you mentioned like it isn't policy for your department to call sources back. So I kind of want to hear a little bit about that, but also when you're dealing with an audio format, how does that change how fact checking is done? Like, for example, in written word, we can add sort of narrative context. You can add your little writerly flourish. In an audio format, there might be sort of a sound effect. Does that get fact checked? Just curious about that, because, is that adds to the story in a way that could be heard, I was going to say read, but heard as a fact. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you fact check audio.
Certainly. A couple thoughts about this. So I'll try to remember them all. Yes. So I think first I'll say that in my process, I get a written script, and that includes the sound bites transcribed, but I don't actually listen to an audio file while I'm fact checking. So I'm reading it, which does remove tone. And it's not written in the same style, as you said, like as a narrative written style. So I'm really coming to it with like less context, I guess, than a listener would, because the listener can at least hear the tone of voice. And I think that helps me, at least, because I'm, I guess, being very skeptical about everything I'm reading in a good way, because I'm partnering with the person who wrote it, and really trying to, like, as you said, adding context. I guess because I don't call sources, and I will point out things that I think should be checked with the source, and then somebody will call the source. It's not like that doesn't happen. So that is still an important part of fact checking. I think with the audio, it is important too, because like, especially if I'm not hearing the clip of the way the person is saying it, I'm going to flag it and say, like, depending on the tone, this could come off as like sarcastic or flippant or very serious, and like, they're using a number to describe something, and do they know that that's the actual number because it's not true, or is it like a feeling? And there is a pressure, I think, that journalists feel, especially in audio, because they want to use the soundbite whenever possible. They don't want to re-describe what somebody said if they don't need to. They'd like to have somebody speak in their own voice. So there is a pressure to like keep as many of those sound bites as possible. And with fact checking, sometimes you can't do that because it's not representative of what the person is saying, or it's not true, and you need to not include it. So it does change it a lot because of just like that pressure, I think, to keep the sound bites.
That's really interesting. And this is sort of more of a process question, but I am curious, like if someone does disagree with something they said in a soundbite that's in, would you ever send a reporter back to re-record a new interview? Like, does it just depend? Sorry, this is very in the weeds, but
yeah, certainly. And I'm not always part of that process, so I'm not sure exactly how it happens. I'm sure it depends on the source and the piece about if they would go back and re-record an interview. I know of at least a couple times where that has happened, but sometimes just because of deadlines, you don't have time to do that. And so, yeah, I think it really just depends.
fair enough. As with many things, it just depends. So Lucy, I'd actually love to hear a little bit about in your fact checking work, like what have been the main challenges to doing kind of a successful fact check that you've encountered, or like where have the hurdles been for you?
In one way or another, it's almost always resources. Usually it's time allocated to something, and that's always going to be a challenge at every level of making journalism in a newsroom. It's not specific to fact checkers, but it does definitely limit your ability to be sensitive about things, and especially when things should take more time. And I think one of the ways it comes up the most is if you're trying to fact check something that involves stuff to do with like the homeless community or some other community that might not have regular access to like a phone or like email or something. More often than not, it's going to be difficult to get in touch with people, and you're not going to have their voices contributing to the fact checking in the same way that your white collar office worker that you can just contact anytime. I think that reporters aren't always given the resources that they need to build strong fact-checking packages either. And I really don't think that that is their fault. Like, I think that it's quite a difficult skill and that it's not something that's always imparted with a lot of detail. And I also recognize the fact that reporters are kind of paid really badly. And like in some ways, like they're paid worse than me because like I don't have to wait until publication to get paid for the work I'm doing. But that can cause like tension, I would say, sometimes. I think that it can be frustrating for journalists who feel like they are being picked at, who feel like their argument's being picked apart, and I'm pushing them and I'm being like, no, we need like 5 more sources for this. Like, I understand that that can be quite frustrating for people. I think that, yeah, deadlines always are rough on everyone. I recently for the Walrus, we've been checking this complicated feature that has a lot of moving parts, and it's been kind of a different experience because it's not been tied to a specific print issue, and we made the decision to give it basically as long as we needed. And it's been, I think, just like night and day working on that and having so much time to like gain the trust of like sources that might not be as like willing to speak with media, and like just having time to run it through like a community reader and stuff like this. Like, you don't always get that level of attention to sensitive work, and it's been great to do that. And again, like there's always going to be these limitations in newsrooms. You can't always take weeks or months to fact check something, but I think you also need to accept that when things are complicated and sensitive and you can't allocate those time and resources, things are going to fall through the cracks. And it's not really the journalist's fault, and it's not really the fact checker's fault. It's a product of the environment that it's being created in.
Thank you. Yeah, product of the environment, I think, is kind of a theme, I feel like, of today. Like the circumstances that we all work in the fact checking industry often, yeah, kind of really influence the end result. Thank you. Greta, you mentioned earlier, just a perspective I'd love for you to expand on a little bit, partnering with the journalist when you're like sort of going through the script. Can you expand a little bit on sort of what you mean by that and how that changes like how you approach your work?
Sure. Yeah. So since let's see, think about this. Often, but not always, when I am approaching a project, sometimes I'll be brought on for like a meeting with the editor and producer and possibly the reporter as well, just to talk about like the background of the story before I even take a look at the script. This is usually for longer projects for podcasts that have taken months to report. So they're very much in the weeds with their story and with their sources, and I am coming to it completely fresh. And that is like the ideal situation for me, I think. Oftentimes though, like there will be things where like maybe something got transcribed weird from the audio, and I'm like, I don't understand what this is saying. Like so I'm always in constant conversation with the journalist, with usually the producer of the piece, just to talk about like what's going on with it, or if there's something where like I don't understand like what this source is saying, like can you check with them? That kind of partnering. So and talking about timelines, as Lucy said, like having months to fact check something sounds dreamy, but usually it's a much quicker turnaround time, like a week or two is like the most usually I get. And so when something comes up, I try to like bring it up as soon as possible so that then they have the time to actually follow up on it. So I think that partnership is important.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really nice sort of perspective. And I think one thing you were saying, Lucy, is kind of reporters can often feel like their work is being picked apart, but I do think it's important to kind of approach the fact checking of something as kind of a partnership, and as like we're creating something together. We're both trying to make it as good as possible. I'd love also to talk a little bit about the kind of way that we train fact checkers, and whether we are giving them the skills they need to succeed kind of in the industry today, and also the things that we can't teach, and kind of what is required to be good at checking. And Peter, I'd love for you to talk about this a little bit, having overseen so many like checkers in your career, and what your experience there has been.
Sure. And I just wanted to add one thing about audio checking, because we have the New Yorker radio hour, and Greta raised so many interesting questions. That thing happens on a pretty tight turnaround, but the host, as you all know if you listen to it, is David Remnick himself, and Remnick is a big believer in accuracy. So when we find things are wrong, which we do fairly frequently, more typically we cut rather than re-record, because there often isn't the time. But if there are things wrong, say in David's questions, then David is very agreeable to recording his his host voice. So that happens. But as far as training checkers, I, for the most part, we have a lot of languages in the checking department. When I was there, we had 8 or 9 languages that people spoke fluently at most times. So that meant that I was hiring a variety of people. It also meant that we did diversity really before anybody else in the New Yorker, and certainly before anybody else in Condé Nast. But you didn't ask about that. You asked about training people. I, for the most part, didn't hire people who'd been fact checkers elsewhere, because I didn't want. There is a certain shtick among fact checkers about feeling. I wanted the fact checkers that I hired to feel very involved in the process, and I didn't want them to feel any sense of kind of intimidation. I wanted them really, I used to think of it as my force multiplier, that I couldn't keep track of all the projects that are going on at the New Yorker at the same time. So what I wanted to do was develop checkers who could think for themselves. And so I didn't have to sit on their shoulders all the time and say, how did you do this? How did you do that? Or did you look into this or that? I really wanted them to come to me when they had a problem that they didn't really know the answer to. And we also had weekly meetings at the end of each of the print issue, and we would go over problems that one of the checkers had at the risk of embarrassing them sometimes, because I felt like one checker's mistake one week could be another one's next. So in that way, we kind of developed a consensus. But I would, people who were not fact checkers, I'm sure that Greta and Lucy and Erin and all of you, Vivian and Ali, know that there's a kind of a naive idea that checkers check the facts, and that the opinions are not an area that they check. And in fact, our bigger problem is what I referred to as fact-based opinion. In other words, they're opinions that are valid or not valid depending on what the underlying facts are understood to be. So that's really the territory where much of our complicated work does. It's not that hard to get people's names right and to get product names right and that kind of thing. I mean, it's harder than you would think, but it's not that hard. It's something that you can do if you're a reasonably intelligent, efficient person. But the nature of arguments, which is something that we engaged with a lot, is the place where a lot of our emphasis went. And I would work myself with new checkers for several weeks on small stories just to make sure that they understood the scope of what they were looking at. In other words, that they weren't just looking at the facts, but they were looking at the, arguments based on a knowledge of facts, and also the way that they looked at quotes, which is incredibly, really quite complicated and possibly worth talking about. But so I would work directly with checkers for a couple of weeks, and then I would usually partner them with one of my deputies working on something more complicated, and then just kind of keep in touch with how they progressed and what they were having trouble with and what they weren't having trouble with. And not, there are people who just walked into the department and figured it out right away, but there are others who took, weeks and months to get the hang of it. And oftentimes they would turn out to be the best checkers in the long run. But I do remember thinking that the checkers who came into me with the most questions over time really turned out to be the best. Because oftentimes they would ask questions that I didn't really know the answer to, and then we would kind of reason through them together and say, well, if this is true, and if this is true, then the following should be the best, best thing for us to do. So there wasn't a formalized process, partly because I don't think I sometimes used to think that there were sort of 10 basic rules of fact checking, but each one of those 10 basic rules had 10 exceptions to it, or maybe 15 exceptions to it. So ultimately it was a point of view that you were developing, and a sense of responsibility and understanding how that played out in the editorial landscape that I worked on with people.
Thank you. I bursting with questions. I have been told that we only have 2 more minutes. Okay, and then we'll go to a Q&A period. So very briefly, I would love to talk a little bit about the future. So where do we kind of see the fact-checking industry going over the next few years, and what do you think the challenges are going to be for the future? I can start with you, Lucy.
Shockingly, resources, I think, will continue to be an issue. I think that if we really want to value fact checking, like, you have to be valuing like fact checkers as workers, and not just the abstract notion of fact checking as something that would be good. Like, it's an editorial process, and also there are real people who like need stable employment if you actually want them to be doing good work. I don't necessarily know that I see the future of journalism investing tons of money into these these areas, but I would love it. I would love it if they did.
Greta, same question. Where do you kind of see the future, and what challenges do you see coming up?
I could not agree more with Lucy about the major challenge being resources, and just like championing it. It's like, again, it's one thing to say you appreciate fact checking in name, but like having the like time and patience. I mean, just as Peter was speaking, I was thinking about all these times where like there isn't a clear answer. Like, the hardest thing to teach or train new people on fact checking is like, sometimes you have no idea, like it's just uncheckable, like this thing, and you have to sit and think about it and deal with it. And that requires a person who's getting paid to do that. And people who will listen to that person who has enough power in the newsroom or the organization to say those things. Yeah, I think there will always be new challenges with new technologies. I think audio and podcasting has posed a lot of new weird challenges. And I think obviously everything online, information being shared, I think bringing up languages, like I think having bilingual and podcasts that are being translated and in multiple languages is going to be something. And I really, really want there to be more fact checkers who are fluent in multiple languages.
And finally, Peter, anything on the future of fact checking or challenges therein?
I had the luxury of working with one organization that took checking and reporting, because checking and reporting, they're kind of first cousins, or even closer than that, they're siblings. And we took it at the New Yorker very seriously. And I think that David Remnick, our boss, came from the Washington Post and was their Russia correspondent. And he's just really believes in reporting. So it was kind of easy for the fact checking to fit into that vision. And so if you think about the future of fact checking, and then you can also think about the future of reporting, the future of fact checking, as people keep repeating, it's extremely expensive, and it's not available to everybody, especially say you start some internet publication and you just have the resources to get it online and to fund a couple of reporters and an editor or something like that. People have to figure out how to do their own checking. So I'm happy to have been at an organization that took it as seriously as it did, and to the degree to which it became part of the almost kind of like the business program of that publication, that we were supposed to be the most thorough and the most accurate. Of course, we make mistakes like everybody does, but I've already gone into that. So it's hard for me to say what the future of fact checking is. I mean, I think it'd be, if we could wave a wand and say every small publication could have fact checkers, then that would be wonderful. But there has to be the money to pay the checkers, as Erin and Lucy bring up. And if you're a small online publication with, maybe a small number of subscribers, that's maybe unrealistic. And in which case it then has to become part of reporting. And there's more need for that than ever, because I think in the fractious political situation in the United States, there is, people can silo their information. And we talked, I think, early on in the dialogue concerning this conference about truth. And, the idea of absolute truth to me is a complicated concept, but the idea that some arguments are better than others is not. And I think people sometimes maybe need to be less modest about the idea that some of the things that are going around are complete nonsense. And then we have to figure out how to address that on the internet. And I just think that the way to do that is through good reporting, and good reporting has to be, even if they're not separate fact checkers, fact checking has to be part of the reporting ethos. And so that's a pretty vague answer, but I hope it's helpful.
I think so. And Ali and Vivian also spoke this morning with reference to the guide, kind of about ways to implement a fact-checking mindset, even if you don't have a fact-checking department. So I guess we will end with a little reminder for everyone to go read the guide at the tijproject.ca.
Thank you for the plug, Erin. And thank you all the panelists. We have some time, about like 5 to 7 minutes for questions. I know we have one or some from online, but if anybody here has any, we can start with those. Or Simon, just a. Yeah.
How do you go about fact checking an opinion?
It's a great question. Do you want to answer?
Sure. I mean, not all parts of an opinion are opinion. If you say something is like well supported, or if you say something is like common knowledge, like you still need to check that those things are common knowledge. It's still important to see that the argument that you're making, even if it's an opinion, is like logically sound and that it makes sense to some degree. Obviously, if it's just you being like, I hate this politician, it's like, all right, you hate that politician, we're done. But you need to still check that like you hate them for real reasons, and those reasons are like backed up by fact. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah.
We have a question from Zoom. We can read that off now. We have a question from Kaylee on Zoom. What advice would the panel have regarding making the financial case to my organization for adding a full-time non-junior fact-checking position?
It's a great question. I think Peter is the only one who works with who has worked with full-time permanent fact checkers. Do you have any thoughts on how Kaylee can convince her publication?
I mean, I guess you have to be realistic about the financial situation of the publication, but if the financial situation is viable enough to afford a fact checker, then I can only think that you need to start arguing with the cost of getting things wrong, which can be like either very directly expensive or reputationally damaging in ways that turn out to be very expensive. It's a hard argument to make, but it's a real one, and it really has to do with the thinking of the backers and who you're trying to how your market works. It's complicated. I mean, people may say, well, so you make a mistake and you take a knock reputationally, but do you want to be in that zone as a publication? I mean, it is possible to just start sort of bloviating on a private blog or something, and if you're wrong, then correct yourself in your next entry. But if you want to be a more established publication, then I think that having a checker in a more active role where they're actually part of the reporting and not just a marginalized, underpaid figures who make sure that the yogurt brand that you're advertising is correct, I would imagine could be quite effective.
Hi, my name is Alia. I currently work for a business publication. So the kind of fact checking that we're doing is very different from the Walrus School of Fact Checking, which is where I come from. But one of the things Lucy mentioned is fact checking packages and reporters' ability to build them. While we're still hammering them out, a lot of the things that I think we encounter specific to the kinds of reporting that we do, which is, I'll say loosely focused on the innovation economy, is that a lot of business people will not want to talk on the record. They won't want to have their conversation recorded. So a reporter will hand in written notes. Otherwise, they won't be able to talk to a source at all, or we'll be talking to employees who have been laid off, but a checker isn't allowed to have access to the transcript. So we have to go off the notes that a reporter has taken, which can sometimes feel like a little bit of a nightmare. I wanted to know if you guys have any tips or methods that you think we can rely on to really make sure we're verifying things. And also, I know that notes hold up in a court of law, but when you are quoting based off notes, when do you think we should be doing that, or do you think we should be strictly paraphrasing? So I guess that's a bit of a two-parter, but if anybody has any answers, I would appreciate that.
Do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, sure. It depends, like in the case of using notes, it would always be better to call someone back and check that you have the gist of what they're saying correct, but that might not always be an option at the same time. I think that if you're in a position where your resources only really allowed you to rely on like notes and you can't get transcripts, then at that point, it kind of stops being about what the fact checker can do, and it starts being about telling reporters to be more detailed in their notes or to make a stronger case for being able to record something in the first place. I think that a lot of sources, especially ones that are more like politician-y or like CEOs or whatever, like they're very resistant to being recorded, and it's not really for any real reason. I think if you can get reporters to really sell them on the idea that this is just for fact checking, and then you won't have to participate in a fact checking call that you probably will say you don't have time for anyway, like that would be better. But I have relied on notes in the past for things, and I've also had situations in which we've relied on notes and I've been like, I don't feel good about this fact to just rely on the notes. And if that's all we have, it has to come out. I guess you're always weighing like accuracy with what you want to include in the piece. And it's just always going to depend which one of those comes out on top, I think.
That's just really just to follow up on that. Is there, where do you find that fits into the sort of the hierarchy when you're dealing with the reporter's notes? I mean, obviously you can say like, well, it's not proven in the notes, and the reporter's going to say, yeah, well, just those are my notes. I know it. So how do you navigate that sort of awkward social hierarchy kind of discussion?
Do you want me to keep talking?
Yeah, go for
it. I think that's where it's really helpful to have something like a head of research position, or at least an editor who is going to act as a go-between between a fact checker and a reporter, because it can be uncomfortable for a fact checker, especially if you're precarious, to kind of basically have to say to a reporter, I know that you feel strongly about these notes being accurate, but there's no way for me to verify that. And sometimes that's going to be the case. Like, I'm not always going to be persuaded by someone's like one page of notes, and then you've got like long quotes that aren't really included in the notes, and you want to put them in the piece. Like, that is a problem. Like, how can you possibly know that the quotes haven't been like fabricated? And like, as you know, as Peter talked about, you can get sued when you when you fabricate quotes. Like, it is an important thing, and I think that you have to be rigorous enough to speak up as a fact checker. You have to have an editor or a head of research who's going to back you up over it. And as a reporter, I think you need to have like a bit of a thicker skin sometimes about being told that what you've presented is not sufficient for what you want to put in your article. Again, I'm mean and blunt. Yeah.
And I would say that from the New Yorker's point of view, we had a policy that we would talk to everybody. I mean, I don't think it's a written policy, but it started at the top. We would call everybody, and that doesn't mean we didn't sometimes go off notes, but we had people who would say, I never said that, and then you'd find it clearly in the notes. And so you would have things that were in the notes, and then you'd call the person and they would say, I never said any such thing. And we would always, in those situations, unless there were reasons otherwise, we would side with our reporters. But there were more than once when you'd get on the phone with somebody who would start denying having said something, and it was clearly in the reporter's notes, and you would say to them, look, I have the notes, so I'm not asking you to rewrite the interview. I'm just going over what you said with the reporter, which are in the notes. And quite often that led to a terminated conversation pretty quickly, in which case the first thing you would do would be to call the writer and say, you're about to get an angry call from your source. Which they inevitably would, and the trick would be for you to get to the writer first before the source did. But we would follow the notes. But it was an interesting. There are a couple of reasons why we wanted to make calls even when we had good notes and even when we had tape recordings. And one is just that things change. That the reporter may have spoken to somebody like 6 weeks before, and circumstances may have changed. So we wanted to allow for that possibility. And the other thing, which I think Vivian and Ali alluded to, is my idea that it's a courtesy to people to know that they're about to appear in the New Yorker. And there is a quality to it of simple courtesy that you want to just call them and say, look, our reporter spoke with you, and we know you said we have you saying this or this or this or this, and it's going to be out next week's issue. So that would happen also. But the main thing is it started from the top, that the reporters had to realize that they themselves were subject to this there was this expectation of them, that they would not just provide their notes, but they would provide access to their sources.
Yes, Thank you. Sorry. Allie is staring at me.
We're just a little over time, but that's totally fine because it was such an incredible panel. And thank you, Greta, Peter, Lucy, and Erin so much for this. Lucy and Erin will be around for any in-person attendance if you have any questions, further questions. But yeah, we're gonna break for lunch now. There's food in the back for anybody here in person. And we'll be back here at 1:30 Eastern for the next panel, Accuracy and Verification Across Disciplines, moderated by Tara Williamson. But yeah, just want to thank again, Erin and our panelists for this panel.